During World War II, the National Socialist regime relied not only on military might or ideology to sustain its war machine, but also on the power of drugs. One of the lesser-known secrets was the widespread use of Pervitin, a form of methamphetamine distributed to soldiers to increase their stamina, aggression, and ability to fight for days without rest. The substance was easy to produce, cheap, and extremely effective in the short term. Thousands of soldiers, pilots, and members of the SS depended on these pills to keep them fighting under extreme conditions. National Socialist leaders, such as Hermann Göring and Adolf Hitler, also used drugs. Göring became addicted to morphine after being wounded in 1923, while Hitler, according to his personal physician Theodore Morell, used stimulants such as methamphetamine, painkillers, hormones, and nasal cocaine to treat pain and maintain his energy during the final years of the Third Reich. Origin of vice, the Blitzkrieg and the stimulant decree to drug soldiers. The use of drugs to enhance troops' effectiveness on the battlefield is nothing new in warfare. From ancient times, we can see cases such as that of the Berserkers, Viking warriors with devastating combat performances that made even Julius Caesar tremble. They would go into frenzies and fight naked against their enemies, biting and tearing them apart in the most brutal ways. Many historians attribute this behavior to the consumption of hallucinogenic mushrooms or beer contaminated with lysergic acid, according to stories dating back to the 13th century. It's no surprise that almost 1,000 years later, Germanic armies continued this tradition. Although drugs like cocaine and hashish were widely used medicinally in both the East and the West, we now know that Adolf Hitler's forces had a very powerful narcotic that aided them on the battlefield, Pervitin. This state-produced methamphetamine was deliberately given to troops during the invasion of Poland. Although it improved the men's physical abilities, it eventually caused a level of addiction that became a problem for the High Command. Blitzkrieg, or the Lightning War, was the fundamental strategy to carry out this feat, and its main protagonists were the tankers of the Panzer Brigades. The Blitzkrieg tactic wasn't particularly elegant, but it was extremely effective. It consisted of launching rapid and devastating attacks with a certain element of surprise, while maintaining the offensive until the enemy's defenses were exhausted. After capturing a town or city, the tankers would advance toward the next objective. For Blitzkrieg to work, soldiers had to sacrifice rest time, travel great distances at night, and maintain the concentration necessary to optimize their aim and gun reload times. Otherwise, this would seem impossible. And the fact that the Nazis achieved the feat of capturing Poland in just 1 month earned them the reputation of being super soldiers, endowed with superhuman abilities. But the truth is that the effectiveness of the Blitzkrieg depended less on the excellent training of German troops, and even less on the quality of their light tanks, which did not yet reach the impressive level of their successors in the Panzer family. Germany's triumph was due to the fact that Hitler had an ace up his sleeve, a key element that was hidden from history for decades, and which, when discovered, became the missing piece in the great puzzle of Hitler's war-making prowess. We're talking about a derivative of methamphetamine, a drug capable of giving soldiers energy for days, enabling them to carry out a campaign that would otherwise have been impossible. Although Germany forged a great mechanical tradition during World War II at its beginning, especially during the invasions of Poland and France, its tanks were not among the most powerful on the continent. Models such as the Panzer III and Panzer IV reached their peak production starting in 1942, while between 1936 and 1939, around 40 were produced per month. 2,750 tanks participated in the invasion of Poland, and although the exact figures for how many units of each model were deployed in the campaign are unknown, it is known with certainty that the majority were the light Panzer II, assisted by a minority of their larger medium siblings. The number of vehicles at Germany's disposal was overwhelming, but they had to hit their adversaries decisively and quickly so that weaknesses would not become a problem. The only way to avoid counterattacks that would put the Panzer Brigades in check would be to never abandon the offensive. Thus was born the Blitzkrieg. However, when Adolf Hitler and his generals devised the concept of Blitzkrieg, they realized a very difficult detail to resolve. For lightning warfare to work, the troop advance had to be relentless, devastating, and above all, constant. If armies were divided into many small garrisons, or if simultaneous targets were selected in a single campaign, the strategy became susceptible to failure. Everyone agreed that the Wehrmacht could only be dissolved into two powerful fronts, and that the only option was to eliminate troop rest periods. This is how Hitler issued the Stimulant Decree, a law that authorized and promoted the use of drugs, especially methamphetamines, on the battlefield to improve troop performance. And here appeared the key element that made Blitzkrieg possible: Pervitin. Pervitin, the Nazi methamphetamine that caused the rise and fall of the Third Reich. Pervitin was a methamphetamine, a psychostimulant drug that acted on people's adrenaline hormones, eliminating sleep and providing a heightened sense of physical power and mental focus. It's important to note that by 1939, these types of drugs were no longer illegal, as they had been synthesized shortly after World War I. In fact, deoxyephedrine, better known as methamphetamine, from which Pervitin was derived, was created in 1919 in Japan and was widely used around the world, in very low doses, as a nasal stimulant to improve breathing. Of course, at high doses, the effects changed dramatically, both for better and worse. Methamphetamines were the missing piece for the Blitzkrieg to work the way Hitler and his generals wanted. Under the influence of Pervitin, tankers could go up to 72 hours without sleep, maintaining their concentration, aim, and maneuverability, and even immerse themselves much more easily in the adrenaline of battle, as they believed themselves to be all-powerful. In this way, an infantry group along with several panzer brigades could enter a city, capture it completely in 1 or 2 days, and then embark on a non-stop drive toward their next objective. In this way, the Germans found their opponents unprotected, even without raising their defenses, since they could arrive even before the news of the fall of the previous city. Pervitin tablets among their troops at the beginning of the invasion of Poland, most of them to tankers and infantrymen. The impressive effectiveness of Hitler's forces not only allowed them to take over an entire country in 28 days, but also managed to shock Winston Churchill, who was coordinating the Allied defenses in the Western Front countries. Churchill could not understand how German tankers managed to cover kilometers in a single day without stopping to refuel, and yet were able to lethally strike at the defenses they encountered. The psychological effect of the Blitzkrieg's omnipotence was brutal for Europe, which could do nothing but passively watch as a relentless wave of steel advanced westward, consuming every city in its path. But the magic of Pervitin wasn't eternal, and while it offered enormous benefits, once the adrenaline rush wore off, it had enormous consequences for the soldiers' physical and mental health. The men collapsed, exhausted after nearly a week of pushing their bodies to the limit, and had to spend days recovering as if from an illness. Furthermore, the drug's supply chain had to be highly efficient, since if it failed, those who stopped receiving their dose suffered intense withdrawal symptoms. Physical and mental discomfort, anxiety, violent outbursts, and even psychotic episodes, coupled with extreme fatigue, diarrhea, and vomiting, were some of the effects that the absence of Pervitin caused as the campaign progressed. Throughout 1940 and the following year, Germany ramped up methamphetamine production, but the blow to its forces where they couldn't supply pills meant the long-term costs outweighed the benefits early in the offensive. German society had become addicted to Pervitin, and where controlled and limited supplies were attempted, large-scale rebellions erupted within the barracks, even developing a black market, until Nazi authorities eventually shut down production to stem the tide. The superdrug, DX, the impressive cocktail to create super soldiers that would replace Pervitin. In 1941, some attempted to curb the distribution of Pervitin, but the measure was not entirely successful, and towards the end of the war, in fact, something more potent was sought. Methamphetamines, although they had a curious reputation within the Third Reich, as they were publicly condemned but then distributed to soldiers, had proven to be valuable when the army needed them in times of high morale. In 1944, with the advance of the Allies, the situation was completely different. Nazi Germany needed its super soldiers more than ever, and several pharmacologists began developing a new drug, an experimental performance enhancer for a Wehrmacht that was losing men at an unsustainable rate. This is how several compounds were born, codenamed D for Droge, and which went through 10 iterations between DI and DX. Pharmacologist Gerhard Orzechowski and a group of other researchers were commissioned in Kiel to develop this drug. They developed a formula that contained 5 milligrams of oxycodone, 5 milligrams of cocaine, and 3 milligrams of methamphetamine, Pervitin, in each tablet. To understand the impressive drug cocktail this product represented, we must discuss the two components that enhanced Pervitin and sought to give soldiers superhuman abilities. Oxycodone is a prolonged-release opioid used to treat moderate to severe pain. It is highly addictive and often leads to physical dependence, making it a commonly abused drug. Pain relief typically begins within 15 minutes and lasts up to 6 hours with the immediate release formulation, although the extended release formulation can last longer, reducing the relief. It is now often sold in combination with acetaminophen, ibuprofen, naloxone, naltrexone, and aspirin, but in the mid-20th century it was still used in injectable form, which in large quantities not only relieved severe pain, but also generated an adrenaline rush, similar to that of cocaine. Oxycodone was first manufactured in Germany in 1916 from the Bain as part of an effort to treat the wounded during World War or alleviate the ailments of veterans. Common side effects include euphoria, constipation, nausea, vomiting, loss of appetite, drowsiness, dizziness, itching, dry mouth, and sweating. However, serious side effects can include addiction, dependence, aggression, mania or depression, hallucinations, hypoventilation, gastroparesis, bradycardia, and hypertension. Those allergic to codeine may also be allergic to oxycodone. Among these problems, which affected Nazi soldiers, was opiate withdrawal syndrome if use was discontinued. Cocaine, originally called benzoylmethylecgonine, according to the international common name, is a tropane alkaloid and strong stimulant, currently used primarily as a recreational drug. The mental effects it causes include loss of contact with reality, aggression, heightened alertness and persecution mania, an intense feeling of happiness and psychomotor agitation. Physical symptoms include a rapid heart rate, sweating, and dilated pupils. High doses can cause high blood pressure and increased body temperature. The effects begin just seconds after consumption and last between 5 and 90 minutes. While its consumption is illegal in most of the world today, during the early 20th century it was a fairly common medicinal drug, so much so that in 1858 it was listed in the United States Pharmacopoeia. Some European countries it was used as a tonic, and psychological figures such as Sigmund Freud used it as part of their treatments and as an antidepressant. Cocaine's stimulant action derives primarily from its ability to inhibit the reuptake of the neurotransmitters norepinephrine, serotonin, and especially dopamine at brain synapses. Along with its psychological effects on mood, cognition, instincts, and consciousness, cocaine-induced neurotransmitter release also lowers the seizure threshold, causes tremors, changes in electrical activity, emesis, hyperpyrexia, tachycardia, hypertension, delayed urination and fecal elimination, muscle contractions, and facial flushing. This made it a great drug for soldiers. By inhibiting most of the natural reactions experienced by humans, whether it was having to go to the bathroom or trembling in fear in the face of an enemy, it gave them an adrenaline rush. However, like Pervitin, repeated cocaine use produced tolerance and dependence, so withdrawal symptoms became increasingly common. Now that you know the three drugs, imagine this: a cocktail mixing Pervitin, cocaine, and oxycodone in high doses, injected directly into a psychologically unstable soldier after 5 years of non-stop war. What could possibly go wrong? The effects of this drug were brutal, but they achieved their goal. Those who received it became powerhouses, immune to pain. You could shoot a rifle directly into the leg of an injected soldier, and for a few hours the soldier injected with Denix would continue running and fighting as if bitten by a mosquito. But with great power it also came with significant side effects. The drug caused severe paranoia and altered mental health in users, primarily manifested as a disconnection from reality, which was very dangerous for someone armed with a machine gun. Therefore, the scientists who developed Project D first tested the drugs on a group of forced laborers from the Sachsenhausen concentration camp. One study group was given a dose of this miracle drug and was recorded as being able to walk up to 88 kilometers without resting while carrying 20-kilogram packages. If the adverse effects were not taken into account, D-Night was truly a miracle of modern science. It is important to note that these test subjects were prisoners who had spent years in inhumane living conditions, weakened, starved, and beaten. This led scientists to believe that D-Night would be even more effective when injected into healthy German soldiers, who were well fed and on a rest regimen that would reduce the psychological effects. However, the superdrug was only tested on some crew members of some midget submarines, as the war ended before D-Night was put into circulation with the rest of the Wehrmacht. Although the Nazi sailors demonstrated greater resilience than the prisoners at Sachsenhausen, the adverse effects persisted. One group remained awake, fully energized for 24 hours, singing songs and working their butts off. But after this period, they would pass out, losing consciousness for a long time. The fall of the Reich halted the development of the next version, DX, although some historians claim that the recovery of this drug was part of Operation Paperclip, the Allied efforts to research and recover technology and science created by Nazi Germany. Leonidas Squadron, the Nazi kamikaze pilots created by drugs and mental conditioning. The word kamikaze often conjures up the image of a Japanese man who was willing to give his life for Emperor Hirohito by crashing his plane into an American aircraft carrier shouting, "Banzai!" But the suicide pilots of World War II were also blonde and held German nationality. The Nazi Luftwaffe sought to turn the tide of war when Allied bombing raids on German territory were incessant in 1944 and 1945. To achieve this, it opted for a new tactic, using its own fighters to crash in the air into the great American fortresses, the B-24 Liberators that roared over Germany before dropping their deadly cargo on a population that endured prolonged agony, as if it were a biblical punishment. The German Air Force was discredited and, above all, greatly weakened by the loss of aircraft and its best pilots. Urgent action was needed, and Hermann Göring heard a bold initiative from the young Colonel Hajo Hermann, who proposed sending hundreds of Messerschmitt Me-109s to ram enemy aircraft in mid-air. The idea was not new. Sometime earlier, Nazi fanatics such as pilot Hanna Reitsch and SS Commando Chief Otto Skorzeny had already proposed emulating the Japanese kamikazes by creating a unit of expendable men who would try to stop American bombers. Zrenia, considering it unnecessary, and proposed creating unmanned gliders, primitive drones. But a few months later, kamikazes seemed the only way to stop the rain of fire, so he gave Göring his authorization. On March 7, 1945, a special combat group was formed, dubbed the Elbe Sonderkommando, because its headquarters were located near the river. These men would be tasked with carrying out a mission hitherto unheard of on the European battlefield, using suicide as a weapon. 2,000 volunteers initially joined the unit to save the homeland, although only 300 were ultimately selected. This number was no coincidence. To give the sacrifice a more epic character, Göring used the story of the 300 Spartans who died defending Sparta against 1,000,000 Persians at Thermopylae, hence the unit's name, the Leonidas Squadron. They were confined to the Stendal Air Base near Magdeburg. Although they were destined to die, the Luftwaffe. He told the soldiers they had a 10% chance of survival. They were young men between 18 and 21 years old, optimistic as their age dictated, who didn't think they were going to die. They trusted in having the opportunity to jump seconds before impact. The consequences of the Allied bombing, especially for loved ones, children, women, and the elderly, brought out their patriotic feelings. They had to do something. Most of these pilots lacked combat experience, so they had to undergo 10 days of instruction in approach and in-flight ramming techniques. However, for this training, they didn't have many resources, not even fuel for a test flight or parts that would allow the aircraft to be checked before flying. However, they didn't require extensive training because the attack mechanism was very simple. All they were required to do was ram the giant Allied bombers from the rear, from the 6 o'clock position in air combat terminology, and smash the bomber's tail with their steel propeller, disabling the vertical stabilizer and thus destroying its maneuverability. However, other ramming methods were also developed in the theoretical phase. These included ramming the wing section closest to the engines or piercing enemy formations, firing at all their members. Finally, they overtook the B-24s before turning sharply and crashing violently into the cockpit of the lead aircraft, acting like battering rams that sliced through the wings and the steel and aluminum structure of the Allied aircraft. These options required the pilots to be very precise because they only had a fraction of a second to hit their target. They were discarded because they were considered complicated. But as the Leonidas unit's first engagement drew near, the pilots' will began to waver, and the Nazi authorities decided to use a strategy of mental conditioning to prepare them for battle. To achieve this, they used every drug available: Pervitin, cocaine, opiates, everything except D-Nix. They were also plied with alcohol, urged to sing patriotic or combat songs, and shown parades. The Leonidas Squadron loaded their coffin planes up to their necks in stimulants. They were even given a last supper, during which they enjoyed an à la carte banquet. The target coordinates were given to them by radio once they were airborne. A military march enlivened their flight, interrupted only by a message reminding them to think of the women and children crushed beneath the ruins. The plane's radio repeated in their ears through their headphones, "You are nothing, the people are everything." April 7th, 1945, was the day chosen for the first attack. Although only 180 fighters were mobilized to fight a force of 1,300 bombers and 800 escort fighters heading for Dessau. The war was virtually lost, and there was little chance of changing the outcome. Once airborne, they had to spot their targets and position themselves above them, like a shark that has located its prey. Then, all they had to do was push forward on the rudder stick of their 2,700-kilogram Me-109s and dive into the Allied formation. Heinrich Henkel was responsible for launching the successful attack, shooting down the lead bomber and killing 8 of the 11 crew members. He even had time to bail out before his Messerschmitts disintegrated. Following Henkel, other kamikazes rammed the B-24's tail first at over 650 kilometers per hour, using their propellers and wings like chainsaws. In theory, this was the most effective method of destroying an enemy aircraft, because the shots fired by the Flying Fortress gunners could not break the impact. But after 45 minutes of battle, the results were not what they had hoped for. Of the 180 pilots who took off to carry out the operation, about 60 returned to base due to mechanical problems, and an estimated 47 were shot down by the Americans before reaching their targets. Only a few were successful. Although whether or not the planes returned to base was unimportant, some of the kamikazes, like Henkel, survived because several of the impacts were not total, but simply severed the wings of the bombers, also losing the wings of their planes. Since the central structure, where the cockpit was located in the fighters, was unharmed, several pilots had time to bail out and parachute to the ground. The strategic victory that Colonel Herman sought was nothing more than an illusion. Despite this, the US Air Force concealed what had happened and never wanted to admit that the collisions had been intentional. It feared that panic would spread among its pilots and decided to cover up the events. Published reports of these incidents attributed the attacks to the inexperience or death of the German pilots. In contrast, in Nazi Germany, propaganda turned the pilots who made up that death squadron into legendary heroes. Goebbels wrote in his diary that the success of the mission was not as desired. Our planes have not achieved the end one would have liked, but we must not forget that this is only the first attempt and that we must continue to perfect the experiment. However, as far as is known, a similar mission against bombers was never repeated. The Doped Kingdom, Adolf Hitler's shocking drug addiction. Over the years, Adolf Hitler has been portrayed as a healthy man who followed a vegetarian diet and maintained extremely high standards of healthcare. However, another story has delved into the myth of the Führer's impeccable health and explored the possible illnesses, both physical and psychological, that plagued the leader of Nazi Germany throughout his life. In fact, Adolf Hitler's psychopathology can be identified as a branch in itself within World War II studies, as can research on Parkinson's, drug addiction, and other problems that the greatest exponent of National Socialism faced during his later years. The truth is that when we talk about Hitler and his health, there are many historical, medical, and psychiatric debates that contradict each other and offer every possibility of the spectrum, from the idea that the Führer enjoyed excellent health throughout his life, to those who claim he was a profoundly sick individual, even suffering from bipolar disorder or psychopathy. and that he survived daily on cocaine, methamphetamines, and even horse semen. Of course, this topic is fertile ground for all kinds of theories, since while there is evidence of some facts related to the treatments Hitler received, the vast majority of the medical reports he received, especially after 1933, were destroyed by the Nazis. The fact that the Führer's health was a state secret in itself fuels the idea that the genocidaire was not, as his supporters claimed, the very image of health. But we'll start with the lighter side, the physical problems Hitler may have had, and later we'll delve into the psychopathological studies that suggest specific conditions such as bipolar disorder or schizophrenia. In his youth, until World War I, Hitler did not present any particular physical problems other than a very poor diet, which he later changed to a strictly vegetarian diet, in addition to a certain flaccidity resulting from little physical exercise, a product of young Adolf's interest in sedentary lifestyles and art. The only rumor that existed is that he suffered from monorchidism, that is, that he had only one genital. However, these claims would later be denied by the Führer's own doctor after World War II, who, when questioned by the Americans, claimed that the leader's scrotum was in perfect condition. Curiously, one of the few surviving medical records of Adolf Hitler, which were used to confirm that the remains found by the Soviets outside the Chancellery belonged to him, are dental records, especially X-rays. This was because the Führer had an extreme sweet tooth and loved eating sweets. Several witnesses stated more than once that the genocidaire would skip his lunch, but then devour several slices of cake in just a few bites. Of course, this led to constant tooth decay, which is why his dental care was strict until the last day of his life. There were also documents suggesting that Hitler had contracted syphilis sometime between the end of the First World War and his assumption of office as Chancellor of Germany, a disease he carried asymptomatically until 1937, when he consulted his doctor due to the onset of some malaise. Insomnia, constant headaches, and dizziness plagued the Führer's adult life, according to Dr. Felix Kirsten, who claimed that a 27-page report on the subject existed, but that it was covered up and destroyed by Martin Bormann, head of the Nazi Party. This was because syphilis was a disease commonly associated with slums, prostitutes, and drug addicts or drunks, so associations with Hitler were avoided at all costs. Although it is impossible to confirm or deny the existence of syphilis, it is certain that the Führer did have a close relationship with drugs. The only one for which there is any evidence was Pervitin, a methamphetamine widely used in Germany and produced by the state itself, which distributed it to Nazi soldiers and officers. At that time, of course, methamphetamines were not illegal. They had only recently been discovered, and they were taken as tonics to strengthen the body and relieve pain, although they became extremely addictive due to the chemical dependency they generated. Another controversial figure in Hitler's life was Dr. Theodore Morell, the personal physician who treated the Führer until his suicide. Hermann Göring, leader of the Luftwaffe, called Morell Chancellor Needle, as he believed the doctor had a particular fondness for prescribing drugs, vitamins, and injections in excessive quantities. There are rumors that Morell injected bull semen into Adolf Hitler in order to eliminate the Führer's body fatigue. The doctor quickly became famous throughout Germany for his alternative treatments, and he also promoted cocaine as a palliative for the most common ailments. Although Hitler recommended his personal physician to the entire Nazi Party leadership, no one wanted to see Morell due to his fame and poor personal hygiene. However, there is much debate about whether it was Morell's treatments or a neurological issue that led to Hitler's health deteriorating dramatically from 1944 onwards, a period from which videos still survive in which the Führer shows signs of Parkinson's disease. The truth is that the genocidaire's mental health is a topic of study in itself and has generated hundreds of psychiatric papers from 1945 to the present. Many professionals have asserted that Hitler suffered from mental illness from a young age. Some have proposed those that generate personality disorders, such as bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, or hysteria. These hypotheses stem from the fact that the Nazi leader possessed at times tremendous energy, charged with violence, for example, when giving his speeches, while on the other hand, in interpersonal relationships or with his loved ones, he came across as a very calm, pleasant, and even sweet person. Opponents of these theories argue that Hitler's behavior was a lesson he learned from dictator Benito Mussolini, who, during his public statements, presented himself almost like an opera actor, shouting at the top of his lungs and gesticulating with his entire body. In fact, there are documentary photographs that have captured Hitler in front of a mirror, rehearsing the gestures he would make during his speeches with lighting and wardrobe tests. Some philosophers have also pointed out that Hitler was not insane, but rather committed evil with reason. That is, despite being a person with the same mental health as anyone else, he simply chose the path of cruelty. What is undeniable is that Hitler did suffer from megalomania, which is defined as a personality disorder characterized by ideas of grandeur, such that a person may lie, manipulate, or exaggerate situations or people in order to achieve his goals. This not only influenced the way the Führer spoke, or his calling his government the Third Kingdom, or his construction of pharaonic weapons the size of 4-story buildings, but his plans to rebuild Berlin in the image and likeness of Julius Caesar's Rome, with his palace as the center of the city, demonstrated that he saw himself not only as a leader, but as a figure close to a god. Gurings' terrible morphine addiction. In 1945, as the remnants of Nazi Germany collapsed in the final days of World War II in Europe, Hermann Göring surrendered to the Allied forces. Hitler's right-hand man, a man who had wielded almost unlimited power for the past 12 years, carried with him 49 suitcases stuffed with looted artwork and treasures. Among Göring's possessions were 2 suitcases containing more than 20,000 paracodyne pills, an opium-derived antihistamine with pain-relieving effects. Göring had a well-known history of debilitating morphine addiction that had forced his involuntary internment several decades earlier. This, combined with other Nazis' dismissal of him as a slave to his addiction, has made it easy for both contemporaries and historians to dismiss Göring as a drug addict. Göring's earliest memory was hitting his mother in the face with both fists when she came to embrace him after an extended absence at the age of 3. Decades later, he still laughed at the memory when he recounted the story to Dr. G.M. Gilbert, his assigned prison psychologist during the Nuremberg trials. This heady cocktail of natural aggression and exuberance would define him for the rest of his life, particularly as he developed a passion for things military and warlike from a very early age. As a teenager, he developed a rich and vivid fantasy life, which sometimes blurred the distinctions between reality and fantasy. He often had extremely powerful visions of castles coming alive with medieval figures, of Roman chariots tearing through the landscapes, and perhaps from this he developed a kind of insensitivity to danger. On 2 separate occasions during his teenage years, he came close to death, once due to an impending avalanche and once due to a fall on a rowboat, but he never gave them any thought, Göring not believing that any harm could come to him, as if he were supernaturally protected from death. When World War I broke out in 1914, he was sent to the Western Front as a lieutenant in an infantry regiment. Eager for glory, he became a pilot, first in a reconnaissance plane, becoming the first German aviator to carry a machine gun in an aircraft, and then a fighter pilot in October 1915. He was a talented, virtuoso and daring pilot, which enabled him to shoot down 28 other aircraft during the war. Although he received a severe hip wound in an engagement that left 60 bullet holes in his plane and forced him out of service for almost a full year, he returned to action as soon as he could. In 1918, he was awarded the Pour le Mérite, the highest military award the German Empire could bestow, not for any single act of exceptional bravery, but for sustained courage in action. Shortly thereafter, he was placed in command of the personal squadron of Manfred von Richthofen, the legendary Red Baron, after the famous German ace was killed in action. World War I had given Göring the highest prestige his nation could bestow on a military officer, and perhaps that was why he reacted so violently to its end. When he learned of the armistice of November 11, 1918, he angrily ordered his squadron to crash-land as many aircraft as possible to prevent them from falling into the hands of the Triple Entente, and darkly promised his fellow officers, "Our time will come again." And he returned sooner than he expected, because Göring met Hitler in the interwar period and participated in the creation of the National Socialist Party. After World War II, Göring claimed that he was not drawn to the party because of Hitler in particular, but because he saw a great future in the small party and believed he could become an important politician through it. Indeed, he had previously attempted to form his own revolutionary party, but found he lacked the talent for it, suggesting that he joined the Nazi Party largely for his own advancement. For his part, Hitler was delighted that the famous war hero was joining the Nazi ranks. Almost immediately, Göring was promoted to the highest echelons of the party and placed in command of the Sturmabteilung, a voluntary paramilitary organization of young men trained and committed to the use of violence, whose mission was to make the party master of the streets. By late 1923, Hitler was growing impatient. Certain that the local Bavarian government was weak and vulnerable, the Nazi Party attempted a quick, sloppy and melodramatic coup at the Bürgerbräukeller beer hall in Munich. With Göring, the rest of the Nazi leadership and 3,000 SA stormtroopers, Hitler marched on the Munich War Ministry on November 8, 1923. Violence soon erupted as stormtroopers and local police exchanged gunfire, and in the altercation, Göring, marching at the head of the mob, was shot. As chaos erupted in the streets and blood spurted from Göring's wound, he was dragged to a furniture store where the wife of the Jewish owner helped treat his injuries. From there, the Nazis smuggled him to the clinic of Professor Alwin Ritter von Ach, where his wound was cleaned and bandaged. Several days later, with Hitler apprehended by the police, Göring and his wife crossed the border into Austria. 3 weeks after his injury, Göring, a fugitive with few resources, was still not receiving adequate care. His wife eventually took him to a hospital in Innsbruck, where he underwent multiple operations to remove bullet fragments, remove dirt from the street embedded in his thigh muscles, and drain the horrific amount of pus present in the wound. Nevertheless, Göring suffered excruciating pain, which practically made it impossible for him to live peacefully. It was at this point that his doctors prescribed 2 daily injections of morphine for the pain and fever. Despite being given morphine every day, the pain persisted. Göring was eventually discharged from Innsbruck Hospital, but by then he appeared to have developed a morphine dependency. When he fled to Italy shortly afterward, he was observed to be supporting himself with morphine. During this time, his wound did not heal properly, and he walked with a noticeable limp. From 1924 to 1925, Göring lost his youthful physique and began to develop the weight that would later characterize him. By 1925, his doctor was shocked to discover that the former war hero had the body of an old man, fat, pale, and white. Göring injected himself with morphine daily, and by that summer had developed the worst symptoms of the side effects, with occasional outbreaks of violence and disconnection from reality. He looked horrible. The elegantly handsome young officer of 1918 had become a pale, puffy-faced invalid. The daily drug injections had made him listless and sickly-looking. In the autumn of that year, while under observation in a hospital, he violently attacked a nurse who refused to give him morphine. After this, he was committed to the Langbro Institute for the Cure of Nervous Diseases in Sweden and confined to a padded cell for 3 days. Göring's relapse, when the Luftwaffe chief lost himself in drug abuse. Although some sources claim that this initial visit was enough for Göring to kick his morphine addiction by 1926, and his doctor even granted him a certificate of sanity on October 7, 1925. This does not appear to have been the case. Göring had to return to Langbro several times to treat his addiction, his last visit being in 1927. By then, he seemed to have largely, if not completely, been cured of his morphine addiction, evidenced by his improving relationships with his family and by his re-entry into Nazi politics, thanks to President von Hindenburg granting him an amnesty for his involvement in the beer hall putsch. Decades later, during the Nuremberg trials, Göring would admit to his psychiatrist that he had taken small doses of morphine for a very severe sore throat 2 years later, in 1929, but denied that this was related to his previous addiction. Once he was able to return to Germany safely, Göring quickly re-established contact with Hitler. After winning a seat in the Reichstag in 1928, he established himself as the public face of the Nazi Party, known both as the Salon Nazi and Hitler's ambassador. The following year, as the Nazi Party's political power grew exponentially, Göring was elected president of the Reichstag, an incredible triumph for the man who only 7 years earlier had been confined to a straitjacket. With such extraordinary economic powers at his disposal, the health of the second man in the Reich began to deteriorate. The period between 1937 and 1938, as the spectre of war loomed on the horizon, was especially difficult. It was in this chaotic atmosphere that disaster struck. In the frenetic days of 1937, while in the sauna, Göring received an important phone call from Hitler. Eager not to disappoint his Führer, he spent 2 hours discussing the upcoming annexation of Austria with Hitler. The following day, he experienced a fever and a rapidly worsening toothache. He contacted his dentist, who prescribed a short course of paracodyne pills, a mild morphine derivative that had recently been developed. 5 days later, Göring called Blaschke, demanding more pills. Blaschke refused to prescribe more, but Göring soon found his own source. By the end of the year, he was taking about 10 pills a day, when the suggested intake was 1 pill every 8 hours for a time delimited by the doctor. Göring's paracodyne pills were a habit he would continue until his capture by the Allied forces in 1945. When the Allies captured Göring, the man looked like a fat, lazy fool. Upon finding his 2 suitcases stuffed with paracodyne, American officers thought he was a drug dealer or a small-time Nazi drug peddler, not the second most important man in the Third Reich. According to official reports at the time of Göring's capture, he possessed the entire German stockpile of paracodyne, and since the drug was not produced outside Germany, he was recorded as possessing the entire world's supply. One source estimated that he had over 20,000 pills at the time of his capture, a gesture that showed the narcotic desperation of the head of the Luftwaffe and the Gestapo. Paracodyne pills caused his own allies to lose both their fear and respect for the Nazi leader. There are records in which German officers speak of Göring as nothing but a self-indulgent, pleasure-seeking, drug-addled sack of lard with whom the Führer has lost patience. As the war progressed and his influence waned, other Nazis appear to have dismissed Göring as little more than a drug addict. During the Nuremberg trials, one SS commander stated that Göring's drug addiction and corruption made him dismiss Hitler's right-hand man as any kind of moderating influence on the Führer's increasingly erratic behavior, while one of Joseph Goebbels' aides claimed that Dr. Theodore Morell, Hitler's personal physician, had said that Göring was becoming increasingly a slave to his addiction. Still, we're talking about a brilliant mind, one who knew how to impart cruelty with a bloodthirsty thirst beyond his opiate habit. Several times, Holocaust deniers have tried to defend Göring by attributing his evil to his vices, but morphine, while it can generate temporary altered states and outbreaks of violence, lacks the power to create a long-term planned genocide, nor does it provide the ability to lead an organization as intricate and sinister as the Gestapo. Göring was a monster beyond his opiate addiction, and none of his sinister actions can be associated with anything other than his morbid and macabre ingenuity. Theodore Morell, or Chancellor Needles, Hitler's personal physician who kept him drugged. Despite the horrific acts committed by the most prominent members of the Nazi Party in the mid-20th century, there are some figures who have been questioned, even by sinister men like Hermann Göring and Heinrich Himmler. One of them, perhaps the most extravagant, was Theodore Morell, better known as Chancellor Needles, who served as Adolf Hitler's personal physician from 1936 to 1945. But the most interesting thing about this curious doctor wasn't the fact that Hitler's entire inner circle hated or avoided him, even though the Führer believed his every word, but that, as his personal physician, he kept the Nazi leader drugged until his dying day. Much has been said about the Führer's addiction to narcotics, but rarely mentioned is the fundamental role Morell played in helping Hitler spend the last years of his life sustained by methamphetamines, cocaine, and other narcotics. One day, Adolf Hitler was having lunch with his inner circle when Albert Speer, his Minister of Armaments and War Production, told him that he had been suffering from a health problem for some time. The Führer didn't hesitate for a second and recommended that Speer visit his personal physician, a man named Morell. Trusting the words of the most important man in Germany, the minister didn't hesitate to visit Morell. In his biography, he would later say about this encounter, "In 1936, when my circulation and stomach rebelled, I called Morell's private office. After a cursory examination, Morell prescribed me intestinal bacteria, dextrose, vitamins, and hormone tablets. For safety, I asked to be examined by Professor von Bergmann, the internal medicine specialist at the University of Berlin. He concluded that I was not suffering from any organ problems and that I was only suffering from nervous symptoms caused by overwork. After slowing down my work pace as much as possible, the symptoms disappeared. In order not to offend Hitler, I pretended to be following Morell's instructions. This would be one of the Führer's first friends to consider his personal physician a walking danger. Other Nazis, such as Göring and Himmler, also visited Morell's office, leaving never to return. Eva Braun herself, near the end of the Nazi era, declared that she never wanted to see the doctor again due to his poor personal hygiene and that his office looked like a garbage dump. Some, after the end of World War II, went further, even claiming that Morell used Hitler as a guinea pig for his personal experiments. But who was this mysterious figure? Theodore Morell was born in 1886 and studied medicine in the French cities of Grenoble and Paris. Later, in 1910, he specialized in obstetrics and gynecology in Munich. He served as a doctor on the front lines during World War I, before settling in Berlin, where he practiced independently and gained some influence. As a professional, Morell was recognized by figures such as the Shah of Persia and the King of Romania, two monarchs who wished the man to become their personal physician. But the doctor had other plans, and he preferred to remain in his country. Little is known about Morell's life during the interwar years, but he himself stated that he studied biology with Nobel Prize winner Ilya Mechnikov, and he also taught at Germany's most prestigious universities. Although Morell called himself a professor, none of this was ever confirmed. In 1933, Morell joined the Nazi Party, more out of necessity than desire. Although he would later reveal himself to be a great admirer of Hitler, by this time all his clients were Jewish. The Führer's rise to power left the doctor practically jobless, and he had to turn to National Socialism to recover his income. Truly, it was the best decision he could have made. In a very short time, he became one of the most respected doctors in Berlin, and in 1936, he treated Heinrich Hoffmann, Hitler's personal photographer. After curing him of gonorrhea, Morell won the artist's favor, who without hesitation introduced the doctor to Adolf Hitler, who needed professional help. At that time, the Führer was suffering from a skin and intestinal disease of unknown origin which could not be cured. Morell told Hitler that he could alleviate his condition in less than a year, and after the Nazi leader agreed to the treatment, he gave him high doses of vitamin E and an E. coli bacterium called Mutaflor. Fortunately for Morell, the Führer recovered quickly. Hitler was fascinated by the doctor, and shortly after meeting him, he brought him into his inner circle, making him his personal physician. This story also raises suspicions that Hitler had syphilis, a disease associated with Jews at the time. The truth is that this was never proven and is more a hypothesis created by historians than a documented fact. What is known about this link between Morell and Hitler, as attested by various members of the Führer's circle, is that the doctor overloaded the German dictator with chemicals. From innocent vitamins, through drugs like barbiturates, cocaine in the form of eye drops, methamphetamines like Pervitin, to very specific substances like potassium bromide, bacteria and animal sedatives, Morell injected Hitler with everything at his disposal. Due to his tendency to use inoculations or chemicals in every situation, the doctor earned the nicknames the Needle Chancellor or the Injector Minister, both nicknames given by close friends of the Führer. Between 1936 and April 29, 1945, the day of his death, Hitler's health was in the hands of a man who had some drug or narcotic as the answer to any ailment, no matter how innocuous or worrisome. In fact, many surviving Nazis, as well as historians of the time, placed the blame squarely on Morell for Hitler's rapid decline in health during this period. Of course, the Führer, in most cases, did not know what chemicals his doctor was giving him. These only became known many years later when Morell's closely guarded medical records were found. Along with the list of substances he used on Hitler, some experiments were also found, such as when he treated the Nazi leader after an attempt on his life had seriously injured him. After the failed Operation Valkyrie, Morell took care of the Führer's wounds and took the opportunity to test topical penicillin, an antibiotic that was still in its experimental stage at the time. By 1945, Hitler was taking 28 pills a day and receiving regular injections from Morell prescribed prescription drugs, which were mostly a mixture of vitamins and methamphetamines, to alleviate the depression that plagued the Führer toward the end of the war. During this period, Hitler also developed a tremor in his hands, which was recorded several times on camera and associated with Parkinson's disease. It is also considered a side effect of cocaine abuse, which Morell administered daily in high doses in the form of eye drops. The last conversation between Morell and Hitler took place on April 22, 1945, a week before the Führer took his own life. Immediately after the fall of Nazism, Morell fled Germany, but curiously, due to his poor health, he died 3 years later in 1948 of a stroke.